There was no doubt whatsoever that the computer games guidelines absolutely restricted the board. G and PG are the things that caused us the greatest angst. And I sit there going, I'm sorry, where are the words for men? So bring on fatherfucker is all I can say.
Margaret Anderson was the director of the classification board in Australia for 7 fast-moving years. She oversaw the rise of games changing post-release via patch and a flood of mobile games that needed to be classified. Margaret has got stories, and we'll talk about the day-to-day of classifying media in Australia and how that works, and also some of the more bizarre things that the board had to deal with. This episode is a little more Australia-focused, but the issues we talk about are global, and I especially wanted to devote some time to loot boxes and gambling systems because that's an issue that countries around the world are still figuring out how to deal with. Enjoy. Margaret Anderson, you were the director of the classification board for 7 years. What do you see as the legacy that you left behind?
I think one of the things that I was really committed to doing was improving communication between the board and the Australian public. And one of the things that had really concerned me, and I've got to say probably irritated me when I first started at the board, was that the board's hands were so often tied by out-of-date guidelines. And so the board would find itself having, for example, to refuse classification for a computer game, which on the face of it was fairly innocuous. And if it had not run foul of some perverse almost or really out-of-date guideline, particularly in relation to drug use as an incentive or reward, that game could easily have been classified at a lower classification level. And yet the board found itself being forced into a position where it had to refuse classification. And then the part that I found so unacceptable, considering the board was meant to be representing the people of Australia and making decisions on behalf of the people of Australia, was that we then never issued a media statement explaining why we had to make that decision we had. And as a result, I really understood and could appreciate the frustration of so many gamers in this country who would then look at the decision and all they could see was literally, oh, the board's made this decision to refuse classification for this game. And the other thing that drove me mad was that you, as a member of the public, could not log on to the National Classification Database and actually read the report. You couldn't even read an abridged summary of that report. So unless the board issued a media statement, you were never going to be any the wiser as to what had motivated or caused the board to make that decision. So one of the things that I did implement right from my early appointment as director was to start issuing media statements explaining the more controversial decisions, or at least offering some kind of food for thought to encourage the community to talk about it. And I think one of the other things that I am really proud of and grateful for was the submission to the Stevens Review of Classification, because we were really wanting to point out to Mr. Stevens the anomalous situation between films guidelines and the computer games guidelines. And those guidelines, both for films and games, were written and published, well, not written, they were published in 2012. That means that all of the policy research that went into them and all of the thinking and consideration happened in 2009, 2010. And then 2011 was invested in getting 8 states and territories in the Commonwealth to agree to them. So if you think back to what Australia was like in 2009, 2010, we're very different in 2024. And those games guidelines are just horrendous. And I really look forward to the day that Australia's got one set of contemporary guidelines that are equal for all forms of media. So at the moment, the whole of the National Classification Code is founded on adults in Australia being able to read, hear, see, play what they want. And if you look at the film guidelines, there are very few limitations around that compared with the computer games guidelines, where you are drowning in limitations.
Just to reiterate that point, that's in the code that Australians should be able to see, hear what they want.
Replay what they want. So I actually love the National Classification Code. It's a very short legislative document, and it's the foundation for the whole of the classification regime in Australia. And I think one of the other things that so many people don't understand is Australia's classification laws do not provide for the classification board to issue a cuts list. You can submit whatever you like, and whatever that media is going to be classified in accordance with the Classification Act and the relevant guidelines. And if you get a classification that's higher than what you wanted, well, then you, as the creator or distributor of that media item, can then make the decision about whether or not you choose to amend it. And you would base any amendment usually simply on straight out pecuniary interests. You know, you're expecting X number of people to buy it, download it, play it. And if you feel that a lower classification isn't going to ruin the integrity of your game, you might decide to modify some aspect of it. Other times, there are plenty of creatives who've said, no, you know what, very happy. I'm going to go and live with that classification and just put it out there. And whoever buys it, sees it, downloads it, plays it, so be it.
Of course, that wasn't always the case. You know, there are differences. The biggest one in the gaming universe seems to be being rewarded for taking a drug, which is kind of an instant no-no, refuse classification. Is that still the case, by the way?
It is. You cannot have, interactive drug as a reward. And I think I can appreciate and understand how they started off with that as a position, but this is the problem when you've got static guidelines that are not actively being reviewed, that then is hugely out of date with community expectation. And then there's, oh my goodness, you've got these narrative stories that have suddenly got nudity and sex and violence. And so then the moral panic sets in. And I understand where people are concerned about that, but I would say to you, that's where you've got classification categories. Do you really need then a whole set of restrictive guidelines that are around those classification categories that are then further restricting, particularly what adults can do? The MA 15 plus again has got a legal restriction, but it's advisory. So if you are under 15 years of age, you can still access that content provided you've got an adult with you for the duration of that content. Now, it becomes easy to understand that concept if you're thinking about a film at a cinema. So if you've got a 13 or 14-year-old, and let's say the latest Marvel film has gone MA 15 plus, they're nagging you to take it. You know what your child is like, and you think, oh, for heaven's sakes, I'm prepared to take my 13 or 14-year-old to see that latest Marvel blockbuster. It's MA 15 plus, they're under that age, and yes, I'm prepared to sit there with them for the duration of that film. Those same legal requirements extend to computer games. So in all reality, are you going to be sitting with your child here at home while watching that game or playing that game? No, you're probably not, but there is meant to be that imposition upon you to accept the responsibility for having some idea about the content of that game that you have allowed them, to play, even though technically it is suggested that they be 15 years or older to play it.
Absolutely. I mean, I can see where it comes from. It's sort of like over the years, we've had several moral panics. Many of them have been about violence in games.
Yes.
When it's so clearly like head in the sand, anti-science approach, that disappoints me. That's like that to me gets in the way of progress.
I absolutely agree with you on that. And I think one of the most basic things that parents, if they're concerned about gaming, one of the things I'd encourage parents to do, there is a report that's brought out every 2 years by a professor called Jeff Brand at Bond University. You're going to be stunned to discover it's people in their 60s, 70s and 80s who are leaving for dead. The numbers of people who are at primary school age and high school age who are computer gaming. It's not to say they are not gaming, they certainly are, but gaming encompasses a huge variety of genres and formats.
It sounds like you felt restricted. How restricted did you feel?
Absolutely. Yeah. There was no doubt whatsoever that the computer games guidelines absolutely restricted the board. And there were times in my media releases where I absolutely would say, if it were not for this current restriction in the computer games guidelines, this game could have been accommodated at MA15 plus or M. You know, it was just that you could have some of the most innocuous content. So you could have been in a computer game and you were required to pick up a bud off the street. And by picking up that bud, it went into your inventory. Oh, so guess what? You got a reward because suddenly your inventory's grown, and that was one of the things that you were required to do in the game, increase your inventory of goods. So it wasn't.
And you're talking about a flower, of course, because we're completely innocent here. And
absolutely. Yeah. So you could have been literally just watching that flower grow on your kitchen windowsill, but not really interacting with it other than you've picked it up. And that's the sum total of your interaction, except you've got the reward. And the reward was, you increase your inventory. That was the requirement in the game. So you're there thinking, my goodness, the game's guidelines are just so inflexible and so out of touch, and they're not fair and reasonable. If as a grown adult, you can watch films where you've got close-up injecting drug use of methamphetamine or heroin or something, why on earth am I being asked to stop you from doing something as innocuous as picking a flower up in a game?
That kind of moves us into the whole R18 saga, where there was a debate around whether or not video games in Australia should have an R18 rating. There was a lot of reporting around this at the time. And, I imagine within the classification board, people are seeing the reporting and looking at the public sentiment around this. What are the water cooler conversations that are happening internally as all this is happening?
So, definitely the board changed over my 7 years. So the people I started with are not the people who I ended with. But I have got to say to you, always, and particularly by the end of my time, I was someone who encouraged people to have those water cooler conversations and to have the discussions about if we were able to change the guidelines, what would we be changing them to? And how did we feel that we were being hamstrung? And so that was something else that I did in my time there. I started writing an overview to the annual report that was identifying all of these concerns that the board had. And it's not my problem whether the government of the day likes what I'm saying or not, because that's not who I am beholden to. I am there to represent and to provide a service to the people of Australia. And so again, that was something that as a group, we had a weekly board meeting, and we were always at that board meeting raising issues that we had come across that week, any kind of contentious or interesting gameplay footage or maybe a scene out of a film, and we were always talking about it. So I had lots of fodder to include in my annual report.
So you kind of answered my next question as well, which was about how you manage the views of all the various stakeholders at the classification board. There's different bodies. Like with the R18 debate, you've got on one hand something like the Australian Christian Lobby with strong views, and you've got IGEA, and you've got media, and you've got the public. But it sounds like for you, it's more a case of just obey the letter of the law and make recommendations where necessary.
Partly, although I've got to say, it was really important to have the capacity to engage with people and organisations like IGEA and to listen to them. You weren't always able to resolve their issue, but I think it was incredibly important to give them the time and space to air their concerns so that at least you understood what those issues were and you could take them on board. And then if you had the opportunity, to raise it with the minister or to raise it with the classification branch staff and to ask them, to be raising things internally, then so be it. But I thought it was an important component to the job to engage with industry.
There was a lot of confusion at the time as well. I mean, some of the reporting that was coming out was not very well versed in the processes of the board.
Can I say I think most of the reporting is not well versed.
Thank you for saying it. Yeah,
of the classification board. The old story about with journalists. Never let the facts get in the way of a good story.
That's right. That's right. What do you wish people knew about the operations of the board?
Look, I'd probably start off by saying, in answer to that, I really wish people knew that when you're appointed to the board, with the odd exception of the very rare political appointment, and yes, they do still happen, and they certainly happened in my day, but the vast majority of people actually see an advertisement asking for people to apply for a position, and they go through a recruitment process. And so what we were really mindful of, you're not interested in getting people who are bloody minded and who are very fixed and have got very, cemented stone-like attitudes towards anything. What you are wanting is someone who is willing, capable and able to take any kind of content, watch that content and apply a legislative framework. Because there is no ready reckoner. You don't get to watch the content and you've got to make notes. And literally we've got a golden rule, which is do not go more than 2 minutes without writing something down. And that's partly so that you don't forget your classifying, right? So
is it also so you don't fall asleep?
Partly. No, we're being very unkind then about content creators. So, but the whole point is that you are there thinking about 6 classifiable elements. And so those elements are themes of violence, sex, coarse language, drug use and nudity. Easiest way to think about themes is to say to you, it is everything that hasn't fallen into those other 5 categories. So themes could be anything. It could be a verbal reference to suicide. It could be someone's depression. It could be breaking in a horse. It includes farting and belching. So think of, animated characters in a kid's film. Find me a Disney film where someone doesn't fart or belch and you're going to have to resuscitate me up off the floor. So, it literally is any content that hasn't fallen into the violence, the coarse language, the sex, the drug use, the nudity. And when you are classifying, you are looking out for those things all the time. And again, they aren't necessarily spoken. So you can have depictions of things. So if I've got, great big marijuana leaf on the wall of some teenage kid's bedroom, guess what? That's a drug reference. All we care about is what of those 6 elements did you see and what was the most impactful of each of those 6 elements. Most often, the distributors would be submitting the most impactful gameplay footage. So we weren't necessarily having to invest, because we didn't have the time to invest, hours and hours in playing the game. So the fastest way to get that game classified was for the distributor or the creative person to just send us the most impactful gameplay footage, and we would watch that and we would classify that. If you're sitting on a panel with 2 other people, you may find that those 2 other people don't agree with you. Now, that's okay. You don't have to have consensus, but what you have to do is, if there isn't consensus and agreement, you've got to be willing and capable to engage in discussion. There were plenty of times that we would agonize over the classification, or we would agonize over the consumer advice. And you could sit there thinking, okay, look, you've got a game or a film, you've got one really highly impactful scene, and you just sit there thinking the standard advice might be high impact violence for that R18 game, but you're sitting there thinking there's one instance only of it, and it's not fair to give that consumer advice where it's just blanket, because if you look at it and you read, oh, it's an R18 game, high impact violence, well, you've got certain expectations. I know I do. I know that I'm expecting to have high impact violence the whole time. I don't expect an M or MA 15 plus game with one solitary instance.
It's like false advertising. Like,
It
I'm
is.
here for the
It
violence.
really is. Yeah. So I'd love the world to know that there was always this incredible consideration that went into giving consumer advice, because you wanted to be fair to that piece of media and not give people either a false expectation or, worse yet, give them a false fear and put people off engaging with that piece of media. Whereas in fact, if they'd known, oh, look, it's fairly pedestrian or it's fairly sort of mundane, except for one lousy scene, that's a very different kettle of fish than, if you're painting a picture that says, warning, Will Robinson, this may be content you don't want to engage with. Whereas in fact, no, you'd be fine about engaging with it.
I think a lot of people understand that, games media is different to movies. Obviously, this is a much bigger time investment. Some games are literally designed to never finish. Some, go for, 60 hours or 200 hours or whatever it might be. So it's very different to, sitting there and watching a 2-hour movie. So they send you the footage of the bits that might be the most troublesome. Has that ever caused problems? Do you ever need to pull up a publisher?
Absolutely. Yeah. And so you could very often look at something and think, okay, great. All right. You've shown me that something's just happened. So it could have been okie dokie. There is now a huge metal object coming towards someone's head. And you go, yes, and what happens next? And you're literally there going, why has this gameplay footage stopped? Does that head come off? Do I now have blood, guts and gore everywhere? Does it actually not show you? Was that intended? Or did someone forget to give us the next 25 frames? So, and then the other thing too with computer games, and again, this would happen quite regularly, the game distributors on occasions would actually say, no, we want to come in and demonstrate the game. And so there were plenty of occasions that we had people coming in to again demonstrate the most impactful gameplay footage. And that was fantastic because it meant that we as a board were sitting there interacting with the distributors and could say to them, so what happens? You've shown me this, sure, I get it. But if I choose not to do that, do I get to make another decision later on that's even more impactful? Or have I now sort of ruined my game experience? Like it's going to peter out. And so therefore, I'm always going to want to pick this particular option. And is that one of those things that's sort of going to get out there really quickly into the gaming world? So that although you're giving me options, for all intents and purposes, no one's ever going with option A. Yeah. Everyone's going with option D because everyone knows they get a more interactive, like more amazing gaming experience.
But in the presentation, they go, boring option A, nothing happens here. That's so funny because I've heard this story from the side of the publishers and the PRs who might go in and present. And they've told me about going into the classification board and saying things like, well, if you look at the eyes, there are no pupils and it's all white, which means they're mutants and not humans that you're slaughtering. Therefore, there should be a more lenient rating,
And sometimes I guess it depends always. Like, is it very stylized? Is it absolutely abundantly clear they're mutants? Or is it a case of, I would never see those pupils like playing that game, whether I'm playing on a tiny sort of like 6-inch screen or I'm playing on a 75-inch screen at home. And it doesn't boil down to not a hope in Hades of me ever realizing they're mutants. And I think I'm really slaughtering people.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Have you had many situations where they try to pull a fast one or?
Look, there's been the odd tiny one, but can I say they were really, 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 really rare? Most people honestly just wanted to do the right thing. They just wanted their content classified, and they did not ever want to be in a situation, where you were coming back to them going, really? You didn't show me that.
Well, that would ruin trust, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it would. And people aren't interested in doing that. At the end of the day, the vast overwhelming majority of people do want to have that relationship of trust and do want their product out there. And I think the fact that you can have a game released, but then, of course, you're getting all of the subsequent packs coming out, expanding that game. And even then, you could have started off with a game that was at M, and then 4 packs down, it's like, even the distributor is going, hello, I think we're moving into the MA15 plus now, like game has changed. And so even they would be, putting their hand up and going, okie doke, you really need to look at this, because we are concerned that it is so changed that it is now going to affect the classification of the game and what the consumer advice might be.
Yeah, and that's something you kind of saw the rise of as well. Like this was a time when updates started coming in more often for games, and they would sneak in things after the release period, which would be unpalatable to the classifications, but also for game reviewers. On the review side, we saw a week or two after the reviews would come out, like microtransactions being added to a game, loot boxes or something else that's unpalatable and would have affected the review score. What powers did the classification board have to rectify that or to pull companies up on that?
There are, in fact, powers that the director has to call in items. So you're going to give people the benefit of the doubt. If people then don't come back to you, the reality was you would get I would ask somebody on the classification branch staff to reach out to that distributor and just say, hello, here is the polite opportunity for you to make a submission and to make an application to get your modified game classified. And so what you've got to remember, and this is something else I'd love the public to know about, you've got the original and then you've got modifications. The moment there are certain modifications that may not adversely affect the classification. So if, for example, and this is a bit dicey, this one, but if I was just to give you an example and try to think of an older film. So if we go back to, 1952, black and white Western film. If suddenly, and that's been sitting there classified for, the last 6-7 decades. If someone goes and colorizes that film, sure, that film's now been modified because it's no longer black and white, which was the original, it's now in color. Has that colorization so impacted the classification that PG cowboy film has now gone M? And the answer is likely to be no. So, and mostly because the vast majority of those films never showed you any blood. If there was blood, even if there was, if I suddenly had a red patch on a black shirt, is that really going to so adversely impact?
Yeah.
So there were allowances made for certain modifications. And then there were other modifications where it was specifically pointed out, the moment you have done X or Y or Z, you now have got an unmodified game or film, and yes, you need to resubmit that for classification.
So you invite them to do the right thing before you force them to do the right thing.
Before you write a nasty letter going, hello, I'm now pointing out to you a certain section of the Classification Act and I'm telling you I'm calling it in. So you are now no longer able to distribute that because it's unclassified and you've been silly and really irritated me badly.
Have you ever?
Because you could have done the right thing and we could have skipped all of this silly palaver. So yeah, I've got to say the overwhelming majority of people would just go, oh my gosh, sorry, like didn't realize that modification was such, or hadn't realized that some poor other staff member had apparently not lodged an application. So yeah, I've got to say there was very little of the trying to be naughty.
Sure. In my head canon, I've got you putting that in the letter, like you've been very silly. It seems like diversity is a very important aspect of this office. And There's diversity of backgrounds and everything else, but do you think in particular the diversity of thought shields the board from any, human cognitive biases that might creep in?
I think largely the best of us were always trying just to be literally open-minded about things. And you're open-minded knowing that you've got this sort of structure sitting around each classification. So you're there going, okay, there's always a bit of room. There's always grey areas. Is something at an upper PG or is it at a lower M? So you're there going, guess what? Because there's no black line delineating any move out of one classification into the next. There's an exception to that, obviously. If going back to computer games and you look at the guidelines, my God, there's a really black line between MA 15 plus and R18 in computer gaming. But so often there was this wonderful grey area and you could sit there going, okay, the Classification Act is saying to me a whole lot of things. Look at the context. Look at who the intended audience is for this game. Is the intended audience, children aged between 5 and 8. And if that's the intended audience, well, really, what is it about that game that's making me go, oh God, is it G or PG? And can I say, G and PG are the things that caused us the greatest angst of all time.
Right.
You would think it would be the higher classification levels. It's not. They are really more or less cut and dry. The agony and the debate that we went through between is this very mild or is it mild in impact? The GPG absolutely took up huge amounts of time.
I did not expect that.
And no, people don't, because you just sit there thinking, oh my God, it must be all of this really violent or all this salacious sex or something. It's not. That's clear because you've got guidelines that are fairly clear about that. It's sitting there going, do I need to be concerned about what is the accumulation of maybe themes in this storyline in this game? Do I have to be worried? Even in something as innocuous as Pokemon Go, if
I knew you'd find a way to get Pokemon Go in there.
Yeah, you know me too well. I can be there, right, having a battle and get comments, along the lines of, oh, you're not very good, or, I knew I'd thrash you. And it's like, whoa, hello, that becomes thematic content. And you need to sit there going, how often are you getting this, in that piece of media? Is that something where you just need to forewarn people that here's a nice little innocuous game you thought it'd be all right, except Niantic decided to tell you you're a dick, or you're a prat. In which case you're going, it's okay for me, but what's the 9-year-old feeling who's just had a day of bullying at school and gets some kind of really unhelpful, I'm just here to make you feel like a moron, and to feel incompetent.
That's so interesting. I never considered that from a classification perspective, but that's a really good point. I mean, fighting games in particular usually have a lot of that kind of banter in between rounds. I'm kind of jealous of I'd love to be a fly on the wall for these conversations. They sound like super interesting conversations between people from different walks of life. You've got Country Bill and Latte Susan, having a passionate debate about the difference between mild and very mild. And it's it seems like that's the specific skill that society has lost. The ability to disagree respectfully is the key to this job.
Yeah, and I think being able to disagree respectfully was a huge part of that job, because you absolutely needed to be able to have the conversation where you were talking about content, not only referencing it back to the legislation, but then saying, okay, what else have we classified that is akin to this? Because there is a standard. And from time to time, you might go, is it time that standard moved? Is it now at a point where we're either more relaxed or in fact we're less relaxed about something? And does there need to be a tweaking? So it was really important, and I think it's great that the Classification Board of Australia, although it's located in Sydney, it recruits people from around Australia. So when I was first recruited, I lived up in the Northern Territory. And, delighted to say that because I lived in the Northern Territory, I wasn't excluded, even though the job was in Sydney. And so I think it's so important that people are encouraged around Australia to apply. And the way that worked was that the Commonwealth then paid for you to relocate, and you were given a rental subsidy to assist you in the time that you were going to be living in Sydney. And I thought that was a fantastic thing because it's, again, incredibly important. You do not want to have an Eastern Seaboard classification board. Like, dear God, absolutely not. The whole of Australia isn't capital cities.
Absolutely. The sort of material that a classifier has to work through, some of it, I imagine some of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, I imagine some of it can be quite disturbing. Does that ever have like an emotional toll, or do people ever need counseling?
Yep. So we actually have 2 set counselling sessions a year. So unfortunately, the psychologist we had decided to leave Sydney, but she had been there when I say there, she wasn't a member of the board, but we had engaged her for a number of years. And it was great because she knew entirely about the array of content that we classified. And what a lot of Australians wouldn't understand or be aware of is that we not only classify commercial content, but we had to classify criminal content as well. So that means, and I guess one of the most obvious examples to give you there would be the Christchurch massacre that happened a few years ago. So we were in fact sent that to classify. People may wonder, why do you need to classify it? And the short answer is we classify that content. So the Christchurch massacre was refused classification. And once it's been given a classification, so whether it's refused or it gets one of the G to R18 or X18 plus, classifications, it then allows the police to take whatever action is appropriate. As a result. So
news organizations trying to show it or stuff like that?
There's a takedown notice that the e-Safety Commissioner can issue. So that's one aspect of it, issuing a takedown notice. But then if you've got somebody who is deliberately peddling something and is deliberately promoting it, and you want to stop them from doing that, or, if you've got some other kind of ugliness that's going on that's related to terrorism, then, you need that piece of media classified. And then I say the police, but it could be police, ASIO, any kind of law enforcement agency can then take action.
I can imagine that would take a toll on the person watching it.
If we knew it was going to be graphic or awful content, then you would never allow people to look at that on their own. There's that psychological thought of safety in numbers. And that's not to say that you aren't all going to be revulsed or adversely reacting to something. But when you know that you're there with other people, that somehow, I think you just feel like the burden is lessened. And so twice a year we had a psychologist who came in, and we would do at the beginning of the year always a group sort of therapy session where she would run through various sorts of coping mechanisms and strategies, but then would encourage us to share with one another how we would cope with or react to certain kind of content. And at the end of the year, we literally always had a compulsory one-on-one session. And there were lots of people who would say to me each year, Margaret, I don't need to go and see the psych. And I'd say, that's fine, lovely, don't care. Go and chat about your forthcoming holiday, discuss red wine, discuss your favourite chocolate. I truly don't mind. What you've got to be really mindful and respectful of is that you have no idea what is going to trigger somebody and trigger a reaction in someone. And we had a classifier one time who was watching a documentary. It was military-based. It involved an injury to a soldier. And for him, that just triggered recollections of one of his own family members being injured. So that particular classifier just said, Margaret, I can't continue to classify this. And I said, I absolutely understand, and I wouldn't ask you to continue to do it.
What are the funniest things that the classification board's been blamed for? In
God,
my
I think
mind,
we
I've
got
got
blamed for most things.
yeah. Like, I remember John Wick 2 being delayed, and people.
Oh, there were some classics. And I remember, so the board absolutely got slammed on social media for Universal's decision in the film Lady Bird to cut out 2 uses of the word C-U-N-T. Okay? And there was this ridiculous audio over that Universal used, and they put in the word coos. And we literally listened to it about 10 times going, what the hell's a coos? Like, why have they done this? And they literally did that because they were trying to avoid what would have otherwise been an MA 15 plus for Lady Bird, and they instead wanted an M. And for all of Universal's efforts at putting this ridiculous audio over that particular 2 instances of coarse language, they completely forgot that on her birthday, the main character goes and buys a Playgirl magazine, flicks it open, and there you've got that nice erect or semi-erect penis. And so, of course, that's in close-up. So they got an MA 15 plus for strong, brief nudity.
Wow.
So you had to laugh,
Yeah,
right? And so then they were going, my goodness, didn't see that one coming. And you're just there thinking, my goodness, there was then all of this commentary in social media about how we, the board, had made them get rid of that. And I thought, I'm not standing for this crap. We didn't do this at all. So, yeah, it was another one of those times. No, actually take it up with Universal. They made the decision to audio out a word that would have been perfectly okay in Australia. It's not America, it's Australia. You got your MA 15 plus anyway, so you could have just left the original soundtrack alone.
They proactively gave us the radio edit of the rap track.
Yes.
And that's hilarious. Well, speaking of that, do you think it's more Australian or un-Australian that the C word is an automatic MA 15 plus?
Look, do you know, it's the one thing that irritates the living daylights out of me, using the word. Now, can I say the word or not?
Look,
Would you prefer me not to? Okay.
Yeah.
So if we just stick to a certain 4-letter word starting with C and ending with T, can I say, as a woman, it has always irritated the living daylights out of me that people insult women's vaginas. And it even irritates the living crap out of me when women do it. And I just sit there thinking, really? Do we ever insult men's testicles or penis the same way we do women's vaginas? And the answer is no. And I just sit there thinking, it really irks me that women's sex organs are vilified. And I sit there and I go, if you look at all the coarse language, we pick on the female dog, so you're a bitch. I then apparently have motherfuckers. We've had an entire royal commission into inappropriate sexual misconduct. I know for a fact there are father fuckers, and I'm still waiting for that word to enter the lexicon. But instead, what are we doing? Well, no, we are denigrating women all the time in the female gender, and it really pisses me off. So I sit there going, yeah, I am fine, actually, about having a certain word starting with C, ending with T, being automatically MA 15 plus, because I sit there and as a society, when we periodically go off about, aren't we concerned about the violence directed towards women? Aren't we concerned about the number of women who are murdered each week by their male partner? And yet we have denigrating language that primarily is focusing on the female form always. Bitch, motherfucker, and that other word. And I sit there going, oh, I'm sorry, where are the words for men? So bring on fatherfucker is all I can say. I want that in the lexicon.
Yeah, that's right. Noam Chomsky would probably say something about how the language we use is a sign of our neurological makeup as well, and our beliefs about life. You know, if anything, I thought it was lenient because, I mean, I was, I'm born in Australia but raised in the States.
Yes,
And
yes.
so the C word there is like, I
My
don't know the
goodness, you
specific.
people can't cope with the word fuck. 5
Yeah,
fucks and you're beside yourself.
that's right. I mean, it's the C word is off limits. Like, I mean,
Yes,
some comedians trying to be edgy will use it, but in America, it's like not on TV ever. Like, or, movies is like, whoa. So in 2020, you're essentially called before the Senate estimates meeting to justify the classification decisions around anime in Australia.
I was.
Like I've been a reviewer for a long time, and I've felt pressure on reviews, but I've never had to go to the Senate to justify my decision making. How did it feel becoming the defender of anime in Australia?
Good. In a strange way. Look, and again, personally, do I invest my personal hours in watching anime? And the answer is only Studio Ghibli, so I'm sort of more the high-end anime stuff rather than your more
You're a
routine,
connoisseur.
mundane.
Yeah.
But it was an important thing to go to the Senate. And I think there was a very big misconception at the time with one senator that there was a breach of the criminal law happening. And I just remember sitting there saying, the criminal law is not the classification law. And one of the things too, I think that gets forgotten with anime is that it's very often symbolic. So it's a bit like Gulliver's Travels, it was all about being a parody. It was about being symbolic. So please don't interpret everything at an absolute black and white face value. One of the things that amazed me when I was director was the number of people who don't understand satire or parody. And, you sit there thinking, oh, dear God, spare me. Did you go to any English language class at high school? Have you ever come across the words parody or satire or allegorical? And so it was reasonable for the Parliament to have concerns, and I'm glad that they got raised. But the Parliament equally has to be receptive to engaging and discovering that perhaps their perception about things is not right.
It does seem like a net positive, doesn't it? I mean, even though some people probably need to read Animal Farm and
Yes,
but,
yes. And 1984.
Like, I would love the Senate to be talking about games every month because it's such a fast-moving space. The legal system can't keep up with the technology,
Well, certainly the classification guidelines for computer games have not at all kept up with the technology. You're talking about, as we said earlier, it is something that was developed 2009-10. You got the agreement to the states and territories in the Commonwealth in 2011, and those guidelines were published in 2012. It is now 12 years later, and my goodness, nothing has been updated since.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some things that I've liked, like, putting labels on boxes that have warnings for microtransactions and simulated gambling elements. But I don't think they go nearly far enough. Simulated gambling is a little bit too close to the definition of like casino games and things and pokie machines. Whereas, pretty much all gamers know that really there's a lot more gambling happening under the hood with things that don't necessarily look exactly like roulette. The time period that you're talking about was pre-loot boxes. But even back then, I was making content around deliberately addictive practices within video games. And that's one area that I would love to see more action from in Parliament, but it seems like people want to pass the buck. Like there was a Senate inquiry a little while ago. There were recommendations made, but it seems like everyone's it's like that Spider-Man meme where they're all kind of pointing at each other.
Yes.
No one seems to really want to take this on. So who do you think is responsible for this? Like which body has the responsibility to step in and make meaningful progress on the loot box issue?
I think classification can go so far. You then have to say, as a society, we have said that we know people who have, for whatever reason, got something in their personality so that they are going to be more addicted to that possibility of winning. I give thanks that I don't have that kind of personality and I'm not playing those kinds of games where I've got in-game gambling happening or a loot box sitting there and I'm not being suckered in to parting, with my hard-earned cash. I think if we're really wanting to have a safe gaming environment, and I think people, when I say safe, please don't just think of children. We all need to be safe. Safety isn't age-related. And I think if we want to have an environment where gambling is then a part of our computer gaming and it's unregulated, it's unknown about, I think you do want to be warned in advance. There are some people in my previous life working in corrective services where absolutely they had gambling addiction problems, and yet they would enjoy computer gaming and they're strong enough to say, Margaret, if you told me in advance that I was going to be confronted with some kind of gambling or loot box down the track, I wouldn't start this game because I know I can't control myself when I get to that point. I can control myself at the outset to choose not to engage with this game. And I think out of respect for one another, you ought to be entitled to know what you're getting yourself in for.
It's an issue that many government bodies don't seem to want to touch, between the classification board and parliament and gambling regulatory bodies. But I guess the thing that puzzles me is which organization, which stakeholder here has the power to step in but is not doing it? Is it Parliament's obviously going to be very political and people are going to treat things like political footballs, but are there gambling regulatory lobbies that could step in, but they just don't know about it yet? Or perhaps what are the extents of the powers of the classification board to do things under consumer advice? What are the options here for an organization stepping in and affecting positive change?
So enforcement of classification laws actually is the responsibility of states and territories. So although the classification scheme is a national scheme and it's done by consensus in Australia, and sure, you've got a Commonwealth Parliamentary Act, which is the Classification Act, and the Commonwealth Parliament's responsible for the guidelines that go around that Act and for any of the other statutory instruments that support that Act. At the end of the day, enforcement falls to the states and territories. Now, there has not been a state or territory that has got either fair trading or police who have wanted to invest time in enforcing classification laws in all the time that I was on the board. No one wants to do it. It's not sexy. It's not terrorism. It's not anything interesting. No politician sees any kind of point scoring for them to get elected at the next election. So it's something that until you have some kind of either systemic disaster that's being seen everywhere and people really can't afford to put their head in the sand anymore, or until you've got one maybe, spectacular or cataclysmic incident, you then get the states and territories saying, oh, well, it's a national classification scheme. Yet gambling laws are all state and territory run and owned. The enforcement of classification laws vest in the states and territories. So I think until we literally have got, both fair trading ministers and attorneys general, and even perhaps education and health ministers collectively coming to the table to discuss loot boxes and gambling and computer games, I don't think you're going to get any kind of interest. And I think you need sort of those different portfolios to be there because it's not a single portfolio issue. if you've got issues with people engaged in computer games who've got that addictive personality, who are running into problems, that's a health issue. And they need strategies and assistance to deal with that. It's almost a bit like the science. Science and society goes on, and we very rarely have the social conversations about the impact of that science upon us. And you can have medical science. It advances at great guns, but we never stop to actually have the conversations about, do you really want to be able to resuscitate all people all of the time? We've had a move in the community that's sort of saying, is assisted death something that we want to embrace and we want to accept? And I just think, hello, it's about time as a society we said we're allowing computer games, we're allowing loot boxes, we're allowing gambling, but we don't get to shirk our responsibilities and not have the conversations as a community about how that might adversely affect people and what is it we should and could be doing to address that. Do I think the answer to it is as simple as classification? No, I don't, but I think that's part of the solution. And again, do I think it's cut and dry? Do I think just because you've got a loot box or just because you've got gambling, you ought to automatically make that game a legally restricted category? No, I don't. But I think you've got to go back and start thinking, what is it we expect from our classification system? What do you expect from consumer advice? And where as a society do we think the solutions to this problem lie? And I think we've got to start having those conversations with multiple portfolios, multiple jurisdictions, multiple portfolios.
So you think it'll take getting those three groups in the room minimum?
Minimum, yeah.
I think that kind of cataclysm that you talk about is here, and it's in the science. We just don't kind of see it yet. And when you watch esports and, the professional tournaments and stuff, the gambling is everywhere. Every team is sponsored by gambling. It's something that the gamers kind of see because they live it. It's in all the products. It's part of the reason I'm doing this because there was a moment I can remember a specific moment like some years ago when the IGEA was playing a game with a Labor politician. I think he was then playing a game while answering questions on the Twitch stream. About half of the questions coming through on the Twitch chat were about loot boxes. And they clearly didn't want to talk about that. They wanted to talk about happier things.
Yeah.
And I heard a voice coming from off camera from an IGEA spokesperson who I recognize the voice, but I'm not trying to dub the person in, but saying that, the science isn't in yet and we can't really say too much about that. And I remember thinking, no, the science is in. I keep an eye on the science. It only points in one direction. So, what responsibilities there's, you say that it would take everyone in a room, but what responsibility does, say, for example, the IGEA have, which is a local industry body within Australia, but countries all over the world have their equivalent of the IGEA. Even though, in the past, they've been on the right side in the R18 debate and on the right side in moral panics about violence in games. When it comes to this issue, I think it's clear that they are looking after their members. And their members are publishers. I think they're looking
after a particular subset of their members. So I think they are looking after the creatives and the publishers and the distributors. Are they therefore then looking after the actual gamers to the same extent? Now, I can't speak for the IGEA. Maybe they feel that they are looking after the gamers because it's allowing all gamers access to all games without restriction. But I think, in fairness, I think this is one of the times you've got to say, who's the vulnerable party here? And it's the gamers. They're the vulnerable party. And at the end of the day, what are those loot boxes and the gambling doing other than increasing income for the game's distributor or the game's creator? So truly, somebody is not on an equal playing field, and that's the gamer who is playing that game, and gambling or paying money, however it might be, to have that loot box, and then to get absolute rubbish in that loot box and think, damn, I've got to do it again and again and again and again and again and again and again. And I just think this is one of the times IGA does a fantastic job of trying to represent a cross-section of the gaming industry. But I think this is one of the times that I would probably say to them, I think your support is leaning more to 2/3 of the people you could possibly represent, and the other third, the gamers, are not necessarily getting the protection that they ought to get.
Do you think it would help if we had like a concrete definition of what gambling was? Because currently the gambling definitions, not just in Australia, but all over the world, they kind of name specific games like, roulette.
I think there's some really good minds that I've come across in parliamentary councils' offices in previous work jobs I've had, who are really good at coming up with very creative definitions to put in legislation. So I've got to say it's something I think we need to look at. I do think on occasions, giving examples like saying a poker machine or roulette or blackjack or something, sometimes that can be helpful, but it can also cease to be helpful when people then look and go, oh, well, it's not that. There's no one-armed bandit, or there's no machine that I'm punching, numbers or hitting a button on. And yet, is it gambling? Absolutely, it's gambling. So I think if you're ever going to give an example, you've got to make sure people understand that that example is not the be-all and end-all. People need to just be really mindful that in that computer game space, we're really, really good at seeing things develop very quickly. And what is gambling today in a computer game is not going to be what gambling is in 3 months' time.
I wanted to kind of bounce an idea off you if I could, which is, I have this sort of dream for a classification system that incorporates kind of what we already have with the latest research and academia within the game space. And, this is definitely not a science that's kind of settled. Every once in a while, an academic comes out with a new theory saying, like, I think there are like 13 different kinds of fun or whatever it may be. And, we sometimes those models are built upon, sometimes they're not. But could we have like, out of the many different kinds of fun, there might be like competitive fun or joyful fun or things like that. And, there are some that I think are healthier than others. I think there's particularly when you're talking about intrinsic reward versus extrinsic reward, being, intrinsic being the kind of fun where you just do something for the joy of doing it versus doing something because number go up or like, it makes you, there was a golden plume that happened. Like,
yes.
It's having fun versus being told that you're having fun. So, could there be a classification board that incorporates that kind of research where it's like, you could have a label on the box that informs parents that, this game targets a type of fun that's very joyful or something like that.
Do you know, instinctively, I'm going to have to say no.
Yeah, that's like.
And I only, not only, but even if we just said, I don't know, there were 10 different kinds of fun or something, and you could somehow score it or scale it, whatever you gave it might not have any correlation for a whole bunch of people. So a whole bunch of people might buy that game and go, oh my God, this is like a 7 out of 10. I'm going to be quite joyful most of the time. And they could get that and then go, what moron classified this? I'm not finding a state of joy.
I'm not feeling joy.
No, I'm not. I'm feeling frustrated. I think the game's stupid. Because I think the game's stupid, I have zero joy.
Do you think that's mostly semantics, though? Like, I mean, the term joy.
No, look, I don't think it would matter what you sort of rated it on, whether you called it contentment or joy or satisfaction, your satisfaction with this game is, like everyone is just going to go, right, okay, so you're trying to tell me what my response is going to be. And I just think, oh my goodness, no.
Yeah, I think the crux of it would be mainly differentiating between those two different styles, like the what type of fun is the game pursuing, because this is the type of thing when, that parents ask me a lot about, like, what type of game should my kid be playing? And, they might be worried that their kid's playing a lot of Minecraft or something. And I'm like, no, Minecraft's great. Like, it's very constructive. It's like Lego. And it even teaches things like, it's got, when you combine the sand with the fire, you get glass. But there's no manipulation going on, I guess, is the main thing there. Like, it's a very intrinsic kind of fun, whether you call it joyful or whatever, it's like that. You're playing it for the joy of playing it. As opposed to something else, which is being more manipulative, and they're designed like Skinner boxes, like B.F. Skinner's like rat experiments of pushing the lever, and you might reach the end of like a multi-hour play session, and you're kind of like, I didn't even have any fun. I was just going through the motions, and I felt compelled to go through the motions.
I appreciate what you're saying. I think, is there the capacity to develop something along the lines of what you're talking about, in addition to even like maintaining the current sort of classification regime and consumer advice, but then having some other kind of almost, I don't know, capsule of here's just the important highlights. When you play this game, you will always have to play for 4 hours. Or, when you play this game, you can choose to be on and off at any point, and you are not going to destroy the gameplay. I don't know. It's sounding a bit frightening, but I do understand where you're coming from and what you're trying to achieve. Is there the capacity for people to think about it? Potentially, absolutely.
Thank you for entertaining my silly idea about classifications.
No, look, I think you've got to never say never. I think it's too dangerous to say never.
Yeah.
So,
well, when I'm the emperor of the world, I'll incorporate that. What do you miss most about being at the board?
I think partly the camaraderie, and it was a really good working environment, and you had your day structured. So if you were classifying, you had 3 tiers a day. So we literally started at 8:45 in the morning. The next tier was due to start at 10:45, and then you started at 2:00 in the afternoon. And you could have been watching or playing or reading 3 different bits of media per day. You could have been doing maybe 5, 6 or 7. So for instance, if you were sitting on a computer games panel, so it was you and 2 other people, you may have had perhaps 5 computer games that you were all going to classify in that time, because a number of them may have been very short, very sweet little, aimed for the 5-year-old market. So you perhaps had, 10 minutes of Baba Black Sheep, that you were watching, who was dancing around, across fields. And, the biggest thing that happened was a butterfly landed, on the sheep's nose. So it became very quick and easy for you to knock those over. So, and I think the fact that we all suffered various bits of things where you just thought, my Godfather, who slept with whom for that to be made? Because there is no way that could ever have passed.
Bonding through hardship.
Bonding through hardship was amazingly good. And I think too, it was also just the different people. So it was marvelous. You had, by the end of the time I was on the board, there was a professional skateboarder, a professional farmer. You had someone who was a nuclear scientist, and you just go, come on, how do you ever get to be working with people who've got these broadly different backgrounds and with different ages? So, I had people who were barely 21, 22, and I had people who were in their late 60s, and we had people in every decade. We stopped at about 70 odd, not deliberately, but I just think, it just worked out, that way, that I think by the time you got to 70, you just thought, dear Lord, it's a younger person's game. I've had it.
That'll be the headline. That'll be the tweet. Discrimination against octogenarians.
Exactly. So yeah, it was really a fantastic place to work, because every day was different. At no point ever did you think, I've seen everything. You had never seen everything, and you had no idea what people were going to submit. So it was really good. No, it was a really vibrant and really exciting place to work.
What do these creatives have for me today?
That was it.
Have you kept up to date with what the board's doing these days? What do you think about the modern board?
Look, I must say I haven't kept really up to date, but I've had people send me their scripts to look at because long before you even contemplate starting to work out how you'd shoot a film, that script has been read because you've got to work out where is that classification going to fall.
Do you change the C words to coos?
Never. No, those words stay in there. I might be inclined to change motherfuckers to fatherfuckers.
Do that. I would love that.
Definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. So, yeah, I've got to say on the odd occasion, and I do mean odd, I might have looked at something and thought, really? You made that R18? You know, I wouldn't have. So for me, there's been the odd thing where I've thought, ooh, is that a sign maybe there's a little element of conservatism creeping in, but I could be entirely wrong,
Sure.
about that. Yeah.
And I was noticing on LinkedIn, because I'm a stalker, that you're involved with a prisoner's aid organization. Is that right?
Yeah, no, look, can I say I've only just ended my 17 plus year relationship with them. So I was on the governing board for all of that time. I think there's a very strong, great need when people are coming out of prison and trying to get back into community living. And we are not good as a society in terms of supporting people to make that transition. There's very little housing for people. And if you are, as a community, if we are going to say there's a group of laws, and please don't make the mistake of thinking the only people in prison are people who've killed somebody, because that could not be farther from the truth. You have got truckloads of people, literally several thousand of them, who are in prison because they have got a drug addiction. It's not that they are the people who are distributing the drugs. They are the drug or other substance abuse addicts who have got a huge problem. And so Prisoners Aid itself set up a social enterprise about 6 years ago called Mates on the Move. And Mates on the Move started off in the space of helping people in social housing move, because even poor people need to move house and need to move home. And then we were really lucky, a wonderful woman called Kim Host, who I'm going to say thank you to at Mervac, was their sustainability manager, among other things. She then reached out and said, look, we're going to start taking out the paper towels so when you've gone to the toilet and you've washed your hands, wipe them and toss that paper towel into the garbage bin. When you have come back from your coffee or lunch break and you've got that single-use coffee cup, they decided in their office blocks that they were going to take it to a repurposing facility where those paper towels and coffee cups get ground down, mixed with organic material, get made into giant blocks that people like Boral then use to fire their furnaces when they're making things like cement. So we suddenly
that was a rabbit hole. I didn't realize that.
Can I just say, at no time ever did we ever plan or think that our little social enterprise would end up in a niche waste marketing stream.
Yeah, wow.
And over the last 5 years, we have gone on from bigger to better. We've got over 100 buildings in the Sydney CBD where we pick up those waste streams. So we are employing people who have been in prison and who are really interested in wanting a genuine second chance at getting stable employment and being able to set themselves up. So it's been marvellous. And I'm going to also do a shout out and say I've got to thank the Paul Ramsay Foundation, who've been a fantastic philanthropic supporter and in at the moment helping us with a $1 million grant over 3 years. So yeah, there is this other side of me.
No, that's great. I wanted to just see what was going on there. I had no idea that it went so deep. Just quickly, are any of those organizations things that people can volunteer for or donate to?
Absolutely. Can I say, please, 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 Prisoners Aid New South Wales, Prisoners Aid Association of New South Wales is a registered charity. So yes, you can make a donation. Yes, you can go and do that through PayPal, but you can always just email us and just go, just give me your BSB and account number, please, and I'll just make like a direct deposit. Because we're a registered charity, anything you donate $2 and over is a tax deduction.
My thanks to Margaret Anderson, and you can catch those organizations at prisonersaidnsw.org and matesonthemove.org. And of course, you can catch Grokludo and subscribe at grokludo.com, grokludo.com. Thank you so much for making it to the end. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.